October 1988. The Plaza Hotel, New York City. Workers in coveralls move through the oak room, prying brass fixtures from mahogany walls that haven't changed since the building opened in 1907. 81 years of accumulated craft, stripped out in a single afternoon, not for restoration, not for any vision of what this place could become, for cash. Because the man who now holds the deed borrowed nearly $500 million to get it, and the interest doesn't pause for sentiment. Nobody died here that afternoon. But something was lost that no insurance policy covers and no landmark commission can restore. The particular soul of a place that had taken generations to build and roughly 4 years to dismantle. To understand how that happened, you need to understand what the plaza actually was and what it meant, long before it became a transaction. The building stands at the corner of 5th Avenue and Central Park South. 18 stories of French Renaissance limestone, completed in 1907 at a cost of $12.5 million, roughly $400 million today. It faces the most valuable real estate in America and has faced it, without apology, for over a century. The address has always communicated something precise, not merely that you have money, but that you know what money is supposed to feel like. Step through those revolving doors, and the city recedes. The marble floors absorb your footsteps and return them differently, slower, more deliberate, as if the building is quietly suggesting you adjust your pace. The chandeliers don't just illuminate the room, they perform it. The scale of the lobby does to the human body what great architecture always does. It makes you aware, briefly, of your own smallness, and somehow this feels like a compliment. This was never just a hotel, it was a stage, and for most of the 20th century, nearly everyone who mattered in America found reason to perform on it. The guest registers read like a century of American history written in ink. Mark Twain held court in the lobby during the plaza's earliest years, dispensing judgment to anyone who came close enough. F. Scott Fitzgerald checked in throughout the 1920s and was eventually banned for swimming drunk in the Pulitzer Fountain outside, an incident he seemed to regard as a professional achievement. The plaza appeared in his fiction as the natural habitat of the glamorous and the doomed, which is to say, as the natural habitat of the American dream itself. The Beatles occupied an entire floor in February 1964. Fans ringed the building for days. Police lost the perimeter almost immediately. Frank Lloyd Wright lived here for years while designing the Guggenheim, complained relentlessly about the rates, and never left. In November 1966, Truman Capote commandeered the Grand Ballroom for what newspapers called the Party of the Century. 500 guests, black and white dress code, Frank Sinatra at one table, Kansas wheat farmers at another. The evening was a calculated demonstration of social power, and it worked precisely because Capote understood that whoever controlled the plaza's ballroom controlled the conversation of New York society. Every president from Theodore Roosevelt forward walked through those doors. Foreign heads of state kept suites here not as convenience but as protocol. Treaties were discussed in these rooms. Mergers were decided over dinner. The hotel functioned as neutral ground for people whose influence shaped the lives of millions who would never see the inside of this building. What separated the plaza from every other grand hotel in America, though, was something the history books tend to undervalue. It had permanent residents, wealthy widows who moved in after their husbands died and found hotel life preferable to maintaining empty townhouses alone. Retired industrialists who took suites and gradually stopped leaving. Eccentric heiresses who preferred trained staff to the complications of private domestic life. Some families passed their suites between generations the way other families pass houses, their silverware, their debts. Children grew up in these hallways. They learned to navigate the service corridors. The doormen knew them by name before they knew the doormans. Staff families worked here across multiple generations, sons following fathers, daughters following mothers, building a kind of institutional memory that no training manual could replicate or replace. Kay Thompson understood this when she created Eloise in 1955. Her children's book about a girl who lives at the Plaza and treats the entire building as her private kingdom was not fantasy. It was reportage. The secret world Eloise navigates, the back staircases, the room service orders at odd hours, the indulgent relationships with staff, all of it was real. The book became beloved because it described something true, that living at the Plaza meant belonging to something that existed nowhere else in the city. For most of the hotel's history, ownership changed rarely, and when it did, buyers arrived with a clear understanding of what they were actually acquiring. Not just real estate, not just a famous name, a responsibility. An institution that had earned the trust of the people inside it, and would only keep that trust if the new custodians treated it accordingly. Conrad Hilton purchased the hotel in 1943 and approached it as an efficiency problem. Weston followed later with similar logic. Each corporate transition brought the same pattern: small reductions packaged as modernization, staff consolidations framed as streamlining, subtle compressions of the standards that guests returned to find unchanged. Individually, none of these compromises seemed fatal. Collectively, they altered the texture of the place in ways that longtime residents felt before they could articulate. By the 1980s, the Plaza had become something new and dangerous: a trophy. The most famous hotel address in America, available to whoever could produce the largest check. The land beneath it was worth a fortune independent of anything happening above it. 800 guest rooms could become luxury condominiums worth tens of millions apiece. The long-term residents, many of them protected by rent stabilization laws that made their displacement legally complicated, could be pressured until they left voluntarily. The math was not subtle. Gut the operations, retain the facade, extract the value. The landmark designation that protected the Palm Court, the Oak Room, the Grand Ballroom, it could stop someone from removing the paneling. It could not stop someone from firing the staff who knew how to maintain it. It could not preserve the culture that had developed inside those protected walls across 80 years. It could save the architecture. It could not save the institution. In 1988, the hotel went to market. The asking price exceeded $400 million. Multiple buyers circled. What the Plaza needed was an owner who understood the difference between purchasing a building and inheriting a responsibility. Someone who recognized that the hotel's real value lived in things that would never appear on a balance sheet. What the Plaza got was something else entirely. But before the wreckage, before the debt and the spectacle, and the long, slow humiliation of a landmark in the hands of someone who saw it only as leverage, there was a builder, a man who looked at a corner of Fifth Avenue in 1905 and saw not what existed, but what could. His name was Harry Black, and what he imagined was unlike anything the city had seen. His name was Harry S. Black, and he was not, by any conventional definition, a hotel man. He was something more dangerous than that. He was a builder who understood money and a financier who understood construction, a rare and combustible combination in a city that rewards exactly that kind of ambition. Born in Ontario in 1863, Black came to America the way many men of his generation did, with very little and a complete unwillingness to remain that way. He found his entry point not in laying brick or pouring concrete, but in the more lucrative business of deciding what got built and where. By the 1890s, he had risen to lead the George A. Fuller Company, one of the dominant construction firms in the country. Fuller built skyscrapers. They helped invent the technology that made vertical cities possible. But Black understood something his competitors were slower to grasp. The real leverage wasn't in the construction contract. It was in controlling the land beneath the building once it was done. In 1901, he engineered a merger that created the U.S. Realty and Construction Company, a corporation that combined Fuller's building capacity with vast Manhattan real estate holdings. Black became president. He was 38 years old. He was already one of the most powerful men in New York real estate, and he was not finished. Men like Black don't build to be comfortable. They build to be remembered. The original Plaza Hotel had stood at the corner of Fifth Avenue and 59th Street since 1890. 8 stories of brick, successful in the modest way that adequate things are successful, profitable without being significant, occupied without being desired. By 1905, the neighborhood had outgrown it entirely. Central Park had matured into the city's defining green space, and the avenue running alongside it had become the most coveted address in America. Gilded Age fortunes were constructing their limestone palaces along Fifth Avenue with a competitive ferocity that bordered on performance art. The old plaza, squat and brick and slightly apologetic, looked increasingly like a mistake in an otherwise deliberate sentence. Black saw this not as a problem, but as an opening. He convinced his investors to demolish the existing structure and replace it with something that had never existed in America, not merely a larger hotel, but an argument, a physical statement that American wealth had matured past imitation and arrived at invention. He assembled $12.5 million in financing. In 1905, that figure was almost incomprehensible. It signaled to everyone paying attention that no corner would be cut and no expense would be spared. For his architect, Black chose Henry Janeway Hardenberg, a decision that revealed exactly how seriously he was taking this. Hardenberg had already built 2 of the most recognizable structures in New York. The Dakota, completed in 1884, looming over Central Park West with the particular authority of a building that believes in its own permanence. And the original Waldorf Astoria on Fifth Avenue, completed in stages through the 1890s, which had briefly defined what luxury hospitality could look like before the plaza made it look modest by comparison. Hardenberg understood a specific and difficult thing: how to design a building that announced its importance before you were close enough to read the sign. He knew how to make wealthy people feel that the space had been built with them specifically in mind, not as guests, but as the point. Hardenberg proposed a French Renaissance chateau rising 19 stories above the corner of Fifth Avenue and Central Park South. The style was a deliberate choice. It referenced European aristocracy without genuflecting to it. This was American money constructing its own mythology, borrowing the grammar of old-world grandeur and then improving on the translation. The roofline would be finished in green copper, visible from the far end of Central Park. Twin towers would anchor the main facade. The entrance would open onto a lobby scaled to remind visitors of their own smallness, and somehow make them grateful for it. Construction began in 1905. Workers drove foundation pilings into Manhattan bedrock. The steel skeleton climbed floor by floor through 1906. By early 1907, the exterior was largely sealed, and the craftsmen moved inside to begin the work that would define the building's character for the next century. Hardenberg specified materials with the obsessive precision of someone who understood that details accumulate into atmosphere. Italian marble for the lobby floors and columns, crystal shipped from Europe for 1,650 chandeliers installed throughout the building, rare hardwoods, sourced from forests that no longer exist, for the paneling in the public rooms. The Palm Court received particular attention. Beneath a vaulted ceiling of stained glass, afternoon tea would be served in light that shifted with the weather, warm amber on clear afternoons, something cooler and more contemplative on grey ones. Photographers would seek that light for decades. It became, quietly, one of the most recognizable interiors in America. The Oak Room and the Oak Bar were designed as masculine sanctuaries. Dark paneling, hunting murals, heavy furniture built for men who expected to conduct serious business in serious comfort. Women would not be admitted for over 60 years. The policy reflected the era's assumptions about who wielded power and where they were permitted to wield it. It would eventually embarrass the institution. In 1907, it felt less like discrimination than like the natural order of things, which is, of course, exactly how discrimination always feels to the people it benefits. The technology inside the building was, by the standards of 1907, extraordinary. Private bathrooms in every room, with hot and cold running water, at a time when most hotels still offered shared facilities at the end of the hall. a telephone on every desk connected to a central switchboard, a pneumatic tube system that moved messages between floors faster than any bellhop could run, central heating throughout. These features have long since become invisible, so standard as to be unremarkable. Then, they announced that this building occupied a different category from anything that had come before. The Plaza opened on October 1st, 1907. New York society treated the occasion as something between a civic event and a coronation. The hotel was fully booked before the doors opened. Waiting lists formed within days. Suites priced by the week found tenants who wanted them by the year. Black had not merely built a hotel, he had built the hotel, the address that every other luxury property in the country would measure itself against for the next 100 years. The financial returns matched the cultural triumph. Room rates exceeded competitors from the first full season. The permanent residents provided revenue that smoothed the fluctuations of seasonal travel. The building dominated its corner of the avenue the way only a handful of structures in any city ever managed to, not through size alone, but through total conviction. But Black's story does not end in triumph. His ambition never contracted. Through the 1910s and into the 1920s, he continued expanding U.S. Realty's holdings, leveraging one acquisition to finance the next, with the confidence of a man who had never been seriously wrong. When the market collapsed in October 1929, that confidence became the precise mechanism of his destruction. Properties that had seemed unassailable became worthless. Debts that had seemed manageable became unsurvivable. The empire he had spent 3 decades constructing dissolved in months. On July 19, 1930, Harry Black died by suicide at his Long Island home. He was 67 years old. The man who built the Plaza, who had imagined it into existence, financed it, willed it into the skyline, died without the fortune that had defined him. The building he created kept its lights on without pausing to acknowledge his absence. Hardenberg had died 12 years earlier, in 1918, just 11 years after the Plaza opened. Architectural fashion had already begun its turn against everything he did best. Modernism was arriving with its demand for simplicity, its suspicion of ornament, its impatience with anything that required this much effort to build. The elaborate facades Hardenberg had mastered began to look, to younger eyes, like excess dressed as refinement. He did not live to see his reputation fully eclipsed, but he did not live to see it rehabilitated either. His obituaries called the Plaza his masterpiece. That assessment has not changed. 2 men built something that outlasted both of them, defeated both of them, and continues to stand at the corner of Fifth Avenue, indifferent to everything they suffered on its behalf. This is the pattern that runs through the entire history of this building and every building like it. The creators pour themselves into the work. Their capital, their vision, their health, their final years. The institution absorbs all of it and survives them. Dynasties rise around great buildings and then collapse inside them. Fortunes are made and dismantled within the same walls. The buildings keep standing. A hotel is not a house. It does not pass from father to child with the accumulated weight of a single family's grief and memory. It passes to whoever can afford it. Its obligations shift. Its loyalties reset. And so the story of who stayed at the Plaza is inseparable from the story of who owned it. Some owners understood what they had inherited. Others saw only what they could extract. The building absorbed both kinds with equal patience. It would need that patience. The century ahead was not going to be gentle. To walk into the Plaza in 1920 was to understand immediately and without explanation that you had entered a different order of things. The lobby did not welcome you. It assessed you. Marble columns rose towards ceilings distant enough to induce a particular kind of self-consciousness. Crystal chandeliers cast light that was generous to good clothes and unforgiving to everything else. Bellhops moved through the space with the quiet efficiency of people who had been trained to be helpful without appearing to try. The message was architectural, social, and entirely deliberate. You were somewhere that had standards, and those standards predated your arrival and would survive your departure. The staff understood this better than anyone. They were the institution's living memory, its operational conscience, and they operated according to hierarchies so refined they were never written down anywhere, because writing them down would have made them seem like rules rather than what they actually were, a culture. The concierge tracked preferences, dietary restrictions, and the more delicate complications of guests' private lives with identical discretion, deploying each category of knowledge at precisely the moment it would be most useful and never a moment before. Head waiters commanded their dining rooms the way experienced diplomats manage difficult negotiations, with total awareness of every variable in the room and complete composure in the face of all of them. They knew which tables conferred status and which merely suggested it. They knew who tipped and who performed the act of tipping. This knowledge was not incidental. It was the product of years, and it shaped the quality of every meal served beneath those chandeliers. Outside, through every season, the doormen stood. Summer heat and January blizzards received identical treatment. They recognized residents by gait before faces came into view, a skill that sounds minor until you consider what it actually communicates. That you are known here, expected here, that your arrival is not a transaction but a homecoming. A great Plaza doorman made pulling up to the curb feel like an occasion. His absence on any given day was noticed and noted by the people whose lives he had become part of. The permanent residents were the Plaza's best-kept secret and its most defining feature. Wealthy widows formed the core of this population. Women whose husbands had died, leaving fortunes substantial enough to require management and lives empty enough to require structure. Hotel living solved both problems simultaneously. No servants to hire or supervise, no vast townhouse rooms to rattle around in alone, no maintenance emergencies at midnight with no one to call. The Plaza's staff handled everything, and in doing so provided something that money could purchase but not manufacture: the reliable presence of other people who knew your name. These residents claimed suites on the upper floors and made them, over years and then decades, unmistakably their own. Some had furniture shipped from family estates, pieces that had stood in drawing rooms in Newport or on Long Island, before following their owners into this new and more compressed life. Others kept only photographs and a few books amid the hotel's furnishings, which was enough. Either way, these rooms became homes in the only sense that actually counts. Places that held the specific weight of a life being lived inside them. Children were born in these suites. Elderly residents died in them. The same walls absorbed first words and last ones. Some families occupied the same rooms across 2 and 3 generations, passing them down with the quiet assumption of inheritance. To outside observers, this might have seemed eccentric. To the people who lived it, it was simply where they belonged. The Palm Court was where the building's social life concentrated and performed itself. Afternoon tea arrived at 4 o'clock without variation. Silver pots, white linens, the particular geometry of a properly set table. All of it arranged beneath the famous stained glass ceiling that transformed available light into something closer to atmosphere than illumination. The quality of that light changed with the weather and the season, and the regulars noticed and remarked upon it the way people remark on the behavior of something they have come to love. A grey afternoon produced different colours than a clear one. Winter light fell differently than summer light. These were not small observations. They were the kind of accumulated intimacy that only develops between a person and a place they have inhabited long enough to understand. The Palm Court functioned as an intelligence exchange. Engagements were announced here before they appeared in the newspapers. Divorces were discussed in the careful language of women who understood that everything said in a public room is technically being said to the room. Business was conducted in coded conversation designed to exclude the wrong ears. Reputation was the currency, and the rate of exchange shifted daily. Women who lacked access to the boardrooms where power was formally exercised came here to exercise it by other means, which is to say, by the means that have always actually worked. The Oak Room operated under different protocols entirely. Dark paneling absorbed both sound and light with equal efficiency. Men gathered for heavy meals and longer drinks, conducting the kind of business that requires a room that feels sealed against the outside world. The space did not admit women until 1969, a 60-year policy that reflected, with perfect clarity, who the era believed power belonged to. The exclusion seems not just wrong now, but almost comic in its confidence. Then, it felt like the natural order. It always does, to the people it serves. The Oak Bar next door maintained similar customs. Lawyers and bankers arrived after the market closed and settled into leather chairs designed to encourage conversations that extended well past the point of professional necessity. The murals on the walls depicted forests and pastoral fields, painted landscapes that men who spent their days sealed inside office towers found, perhaps, oddly consoling. The contrast between the scenes on the walls and the conversations happening beneath them was total, and nobody seemed to mind. The Persian Room offered something different, the Plaza after dark, as theatre. Eartha Kitt performed there during her ascent. Hildegard drew audiences who dressed for the occasion with the seriousness of people attending something that mattered. The room had a stage and a dance floor, and tables arranged so that every seat offered a view of every other seat, because seeing and being seen were not incidental to the evening. They were the evening. The Grand Ballroom operated at a scale that made the rest of the building feel intimate. Debutante balls introduced young women to a society that had very specific ideas about what that introduction should look like. Charity galas raised money for causes that the room's occupants had decided were worthy of their attention. Corporate celebrations dressed commercial success in the language of elegance. The room could hold over 1,000 people and had chandeliers that required their own maintenance schedule. In November 1966, Truman Capote chose this room for what the press immediately and accurately identified as the social event of the decade. 500 invitations went out. The guest list became front-page news before a single guest had arrived. Capote seated Frank Sinatra beside people who had never heard of him and Kansas farmers beside women who had never been to Kansas. And the evening worked precisely because the Grand Ballroom of the Plaza was the one room in America where that combination made a kind of sense. Whoever controlled that room controlled, at least for an evening, the city's conversation about itself. Capote understood this, which is why he chose it. The staff who made all of this possible moved through the building like a second invisible institution operating inside the first. Housekeepers who changed the same guest sheets for 30 years. Elevator operators who memorized every resident's floor without being asked and never mentioned that they had. Kitchen workers who maintained exacting standards through ownership changes and budget cycles, and the various disruptions that institutional life periodically produces. These employees passed their knowledge to younger colleagues in informal apprenticeships that no training manual could have replicated, because what was being transferred was not procedure but judgment, the accumulated understanding of how this particular place worked and what it required of the people inside it. Some Plaza families spanned multiple generations of service. Sons followed fathers into positions their fathers had held for decades. Daughters joined mothers in departments that had become, in some complicated and unspoken way, family territory. Their investment in the Plaza's standards was not abstract, it was personal. They maintained excellence not because a corporate policy required it, but because the alternative was a kind of betrayal of something they had helped build. Kay Thompson understood this hidden architecture when she created Eloise in 1955. The child who lived at the Plaza and treated its corridors as her private kingdom was not a fantasy figure. She was a precise description of something real. the secret life that existed behind the public grandeur, the communities that formed in service corridors and back stairwells, the layered reality of a building that was simultaneously a grand hotel, a residential community, a workplace, and a world unto itself. Multiple lives were being lived inside these walls at all times, in rooms adjacent to each other, rarely intersecting. The plaza contained all of them: the widow with her inherited furniture, the doorman who had been standing at the same entrance for 20 years, the debutante descending the grand staircase for the first and most important time, the kitchen worker who had been awake since 4 in the morning so that breakfast would be ready before anyone thought to ask for it. This was the plaza in its fullness. Not the facade, not the famous name. This. For roughly half a century, the plaza sustained the illusion that great institutions are immune to time. The routines held. The standards did not visibly slip. Guests who returned after years away found the same doorman at the entrance, the same waiters who remembered how they took their coffee, the same afternoon light coming through the palm court ceiling at the same angle it always had. This consistency was not accidental. It was the product of a staff culture so deeply embedded that it functioned almost independently of whoever held ownership, a living organism that had learned to protect itself. For guests, it produced something increasingly rare in American life: the reliable sensation that some things do not change, that somewhere the world still holds its shape. But institutions are not organisms. They do not regenerate on their own. They require investment, sustained attention, and, most critically, owners who understand the difference between managing an asset and stewarding one. The plaza would spend the next 40 years discovering what happens when that distinction is lost. Conrad Hilton purchased the hotel in 1943. He was not buying a home, he was buying a name. Hilton had built his fortune acquiring distressed properties during the Depression, hotels that had been broken by the crash and could be absorbed cheaply, standardized, and returned to profitability. The plaza was not distressed. It was, by any measure, the most prestigious hotel address in America. But Hilton's instincts were the same regardless of what he was buying: identify the inefficiencies, impose the system, extract the returns. Every Hilton property operated from the same playbook: the same accounting methods, the same training protocols, the same performance benchmarks applied with identical pressure, whether the building in question was a motor lodge in Tulsa or a limestone landmark facing Central Park. The plaza's culture had never been written down because it had never needed to be. It existed in the specific knowledge held by specific people: the concierge who had been managing guests' complications for 20 years, the housekeeper who understood the particular preferences of the third-floor residents without being reminded, the doorman who could read the mood of an arriving guest from 50 feet away and adjust accordingly. This kind of knowledge does not transfer through a training manual. It lives in individuals, and when those individuals are replaced by employees trained to meet a corporate standard rather than an institutional one, it simply disappears. The changes arrived gradually, which made them easier to miss and harder to reverse. Staff positions consolidated. Departments that had operated with their own internal logic were absorbed into corporate reporting structures. Long-tenured employees who embodied the plaza's accumulated wisdom found their expertise treated as idiosyncrasy, a complication rather than an asset. The new management wanted consistency with the Hilton portfolio. The plaza's distinctiveness, the very quality that justified its premium rates, was reframed as a problem to be rationalized away. Some things survived. The palm court still served tea. The oak room still excluded women. The permanent residents still occupied their suites. But the texture of the place had shifted in ways that the people who knew it best could feel before they could name. Slightly cheaper supplies, slightly thinner staffing, slightly less of everything that had made the plaza feel like the plaza, and slightly more of everything that made it feel like a very expensive hotel. Each individual compromise was defensible in isolation. In aggregate, they were erosion. Hilton sold the property in 1953 to a real estate investor named A.M. Sonnabend for $15 million. Sonnabend managed the hotel competently and without distinction. The building functioned. The standards held at their new, slightly reduced level. Nothing collapsed. Nothing was restored. Then New York itself began to come apart. The 1970s visited a particular kind of violence on the city's self-image. Municipal bankruptcy threatened. Crime rates climbed to numbers that made the front pages of newspapers across the country. Wealthy families who had anchored the city's social fabric for generations packed up and moved to Connecticut, to Westchester, to anywhere that felt less like a city in the process of abandoning itself. Companies that had headquartered in Manhattan for decades quietly relocated. The tourists stopped coming in the numbers that had once seemed inexhaustible. The city that had spent 70 years positioning itself as the center of the world was suddenly looking like a cautionary tale. The Plaza absorbed these pressures with nowhere to put them. Occupancy rates dropped. The permanent residents, that aging community of widows and retirees, whose steady presence had provided both revenue and character, began dying without replacement. Young, wealthy families were not moving into hotel suites in a city their peers were fleeing. The upper floors that had housed the same families across 2 and 3 generations grew quieter, and then, in some cases, dark. The building's physical needs did not pause to accommodate the revenue shortfall. Pipes corroded. Electrical systems that had been innovative in 1907 were now simply old. The limestone facade weathered and demanded repair. The chandeliers required specialized maintenance that could not be deferred without consequence. Operating an 80-year-old building cost substantially more than operating a modern one, and the gap between what the Plaza required and what it was generating began to widen in ways that no amount of cost management could close. Western Hotels acquired the property in 1975. Another corporate owner, another wave of standardized procedures, another management team that understood the Plaza's value as a brand and experienced its institutional complexity as overhead. The permanent residents watched this transition with the particular unease of people who have learned to read the signs. Each new ownership brought new rules, new restrictions, new staff who did not know their names or their histories, new managers who looked at long-term tenants, many of them protected by New York's rent stabilization laws, and saw not community members, but encumbrances. The legal protections were real. Rent-stabilized tenants could not be easily removed or priced out. Their rights were codified and enforceable. But rights, however valid, do not produce warmth. They do not compel a new building manager to learn which resident needs the elevator held, or which one has a heart condition that makes a maintenance delay genuinely dangerous, or which one has been eating breakfast in the Palm Court every morning for 31 years and regards the head waiter as among her closest friends. The law protected occupancy. It could not protect belonging. 1969 brought 2 changes that arrived, on the surface, in opposite directions. The first, the National Organization for Women targeted the Plaza's Oak Room directly, staging protests and filing complaints against its 62-year policy of excluding women. The hotel surrendered. The Oak Room opened. Some of the men who had regarded it as a sanctuary grumbled. Most adapted within weeks. The policy that had seemed as natural and permanent as the paneling on the walls turned out to be simply a choice, one that had been made in a particular era and could be unmade in another. This was worth understanding beyond the specific question of who was allowed to order lunch. It meant that traditions which felt constitutional were in fact optional, that what had been chosen could be reconsidered, that the Plaza's customs, however long established, were not laws of nature. The second change, arriving the same year, the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission designated the Plaza's exterior as a protected landmark. The facade, the limestone, the copper roof, the distinctive fenestration, could no longer be altered without commission review and approval. The building's appearance was legally insulated from owners who might prefer cheaper materials or more contemporary aesthetics. The interior protections followed in 1986. The Palm Court, the Oak Room, the Grand Ballroom, the Terrace Room, all designated as interior landmarks. The stained glass ceiling, the oak paneling, the plasterwork, the architectural features that made these spaces irreplaceable, protected by law. It was a genuine victory, hard won through decades of preservation advocacy. And it was, simultaneously, insufficient in the way that all legal protections for living institutions are ultimately insufficient. Landmark law protects surfaces. It cannot mandate the investment required to keep those surfaces from slowly deteriorating. It cannot compel an owner to care. It cannot preserve the staff culture that developed inside those protected rooms over 80 years. It cannot protect the community of permanent residents whose presence gave those rooms their social meaning. It cannot codify the accumulated institutional knowledge that distinguishes a great hotel from a beautiful building that happens to rent rooms. An owner determined to extract maximum value from a landmark property while spending the legal minimum could hollow out everything that made the plaza matter. Fire the staff, eliminate the services, pressure the tenants, defer the maintenance, and remain in full technical compliance with every preservation regulation on the books. The law drew a line around the architecture. It left everything else exposed. By the mid-1980s, the plaza's fame had become untethered from its performance. The name retained its power. The building retained its beauty. But newer luxury hotels were offering amenities the plaza could not match without capital investment that no recent owner had been willing to commit. Business travelers increasingly chose convenience over prestige. The permanent residential community that had sustained the hotel's identity for decades had been reduced to a handful of elderly tenants in a building that was already calculating how to be rid of them. The plaza went to market in 1988 with an asking price north of $400 million. What a buyer would actually be purchasing was complicated. The most famous hotel name in America, yes, but also landmark protections that constrained what could be changed. Rent-stabilized tenants with legal rights that constrained who could be removed. A building 80 years old that would require serious and sustained investment simply to hold its current position. A staff culture damaged by 4 decades of corporate ownership but not yet beyond recovery. What the plaza needed, at that precise moment in its history, was the rarest kind of owner. One with the resources to invest properly, the intelligence to understand what was actually at stake, and the restraint to recognize that some of the hotel's most important qualities existed precisely because no previous owner had been able to quantify them. Instead, the plaza got a man who saw a trophy and decided to put his name on it. Donald Trump purchased the Plaza Hotel in March 1988 for $407.5 million. He announced the acquisition at a press conference with the particular confidence of a man who has never seriously distinguished between wanting something and deserving it. He would restore the plaza to its original grandeur, he said. He would make it the greatest hotel in the world. The promises were sweeping and immediate and completely untethered from any plan to achieve them. The financing structure told the actual story for anyone willing to read it. Trump had borrowed nearly the entire purchase price. The debt carried interest rates exceeding 14%. The annual service on that debt was enormous, a number the hotel would need to dramatically exceed its existing revenue just to approach. Financial analysts ran the arithmetic publicly and found it didn't work. Trump dismissed them. He had a gift for treating skepticism as a failure of imagination in the skeptic. He installed Ivana Trump as president of the plaza. Her official annual salary was $1, plus, as he announced with evident delight, all the dresses she could buy. The tabloids loved it. The hotel's longtime staff watched the new regime arrive and understood, with the clarity of people who had spent careers reading rooms, exactly what was coming. The changes began within weeks, not renovations, reductions. Trump ordered immediate cost cuts throughout the operation. Staffing levels he considered excessive were addressed the only way cost-cutting ever addresses them. People were let go. Departments were consolidated. Employees who had worked at the plaza for 10, 15, 20 years received termination notices that made no distinction between their tenure and their irrelevance. They left. And what left with them, the institutional knowledge, the accumulated competence, the specific understanding of how this particular building worked and what it required, was not replaceable by any hiring process or training program ever devised because it had taken decades to develop and could not be compressed. Service quality declined in the way that service quality always declines when the people responsible for it are exhausted, understaffed, and operating under management that has made clear their expertise is an overhead problem. First-time guests saw luxury and were satisfied. Regulars, the guests who had been returning for years, who knew what the plaza was supposed to feel like, noticed immediately. They said so. Their complaints were received as the grievances of people who expected too much. Trump announced plans to convert the upper floor guest rooms into private condominiums. The units would sell for millions each, generating one-time capital that could be applied to the crushing debt. The logic was straightforward, and the consequences were permanent. Every room converted was a room removed from the hotel inventory forever. The plaza would shrink as a hotel while its owner extracted whatever capital the conversion could produce. The permanent residents understood the threat precisely. They had lived in this building for years, some for decades, and they recognized the classic mechanics of what was being done to them. Condominium conversion was the first move. Pressure on existing tenants was the second. Their rent-stabilized leases provided legal protection against eviction, but legal protection and livability are different things. New owners had methods. Maintenance requests could go unanswered. Common areas could deteriorate. The social fabric of a residential community could be shredded by enough hostility and neglect until the people who had rights simply decided the rights weren't worth defending anymore. The residents organized. They filed complaints, documented violations, challenged proposals through every available channel. Trump's representatives responded with the aggression of people who considered this a negotiation with an inevitable outcome. The legal warfare that followed was sustained, bitter, and conducted entirely within a building that had once functioned as a community. The conversions proceeded anyway. Construction crews moved through floors that had housed guests since 1907. Units were reconfigured and staged and sold to buyers who wanted a plaza address and had no particular feeling about what a plaza address had historically meant. Some sold for over $10 million. The revenue serviced a portion of the debt. It also permanently altered what the building was. Across Fifth Avenue, Leona Helmsley owned the Park Lane Hotel and despised Trump with a specificity that suggested personal history. The feud played out in tabloid coverage that New York consumed with the enthusiasm it reserves for spectacle involving people it already distrusts. Helmsley was convicted of tax evasion in 1989. Her remark that only little people pay taxes achieving the rare distinction of becoming instantly legendary, and the coverage consumed weeks of front pages. The plaza's mounting operational crisis received considerably less attention. One story was entertaining. The other was simply sad. By 1990, the hotel carried approximately $250 million in debt to its bondholders. The interest payments exceeded what the property could generate. Trump's other holdings were collapsing simultaneously. The Atlantic City casinos buried under their own leveraged debt, the airline hemorrhaging cash, the yacht and the mansions consuming money while producing none. The empire had been constructed entirely on borrowed capital, and borrowed capital, eventually, must be reckoned with. Trump continued making public statements that bore no traceable relationship to the internal reality of his finances. He declared the plaza a success, while his representatives negotiated with creditors in private. He announced expansion plans, while the building deferred maintenance on systems that had been neglected for years. The gap between the performance and the reality was total, and it was sustained with a consistency that would have been impressive if it had been applied to anything useful. Former employees, speaking to journalists years later, described the management atmosphere as one of constant, low-grade chaos. Decisions arrived from ownership without consultation, without context, and often without logic that anyone inside the operation could identify. Expertise was not valued because expertise implied that the people who held it had authority, and authority in this structure flowed in only one direction. Long-term thinking was functionally impossible because short-term survival was consuming every available resource. The institutional culture that had taken 8 decades to develop was being actively dismantled, not through malice specifically, but through the operational logic of a debt structure that required extracting more than the Plaza could honestly give. In November 1992, Trump surrendered operational control of the Plaza to his creditors. The restructuring agreement reduced the debt and distributed the wreckage with precision. Bondholders who had financed the purchase received 49% ownership in a property worth substantially less than their original investment. Trump retained 49% but lost management authority. Citibank and affiliated lenders held the remainder. The grand restoration he had promised 4 years earlier had produced bankruptcy paperwork. The creditors who had believed in the transaction absorbed the losses. The man who had designed it retained his celebrity, his minority stake, and his undiminished appetite for the next deal. This was not, it would become clear, an anomaly. It was a method. The damage the 4 Trump years left behind was specific and extensively documented by the people who had to work within it. Deferred maintenance had accumulated throughout the building, not the catastrophic kind that produces immediate headlines, but the persistent kind that degrades irreplaceable things slowly, in ways that become visible only after the window for easy repair has closed. Systems that required regular attention had been ignored. The famous fixtures showed where that proper maintenance would have prevented. The staff who understood how to care for these elements, who knew which chandelier needed what treatment, which plaster required which approach, which detail could tolerate a delay and which could not, had been eliminated in the cost-cutting rounds, and their knowledge had left with them and would not be coming back. The workforce that remained was operating at a fraction of the capacity the building required. Service quality had declined to the point where guests who remembered the Plaza from before 1988 and guests who encountered it for the first time were, in some meaningful sense, experiencing different hotels. One group had a reference point. The other did not. The permanent residential community had been broken. Some residents had surrendered and moved out, accepting buyouts or simply conceding that the building they had loved was no longer the building they were being asked to live in. Those who remained had spent 4 years in a state of sustained legal combat with their landlord. They had won enough battles to stay. They had lost the thing they had been fighting to protect, the community itself, the daily life of a place that had once been genuinely inhabited and was now merely occupied. The condominium conversions were permanent. 800 rooms had become fewer than 500. The Plaza was now, functionally, a residential building with a hotel component, an inversion of purpose that contradicted everything Harry Black had built and everything Henry Hardenberg had designed. The new condominium owners had purchased addresses. They had not purchased membership in anything. They ate breakfast somewhere else and arrived at the Plaza with luggage when it suited them, and left when it did not. The building contained them. It did not know them. Preservationists took inventory. The landmark protected spaces had survived largely intact. The palm court ceiling, the oak room paneling, the grand ballroom's architectural features. The law had held where the law could reach. What the law could not reach had not survived. The service culture, the residential community, the accumulated institutional knowledge that had made the Plaza not merely a luxury hotel, but a specific and irreplaceable kind of place. All of it was gone or damaged beyond any straightforward restoration. Trump emerged from the bankruptcy in the condition that would define his subsequent career, having failed comprehensively, having cost the people who trusted him enormous sums, having damaged something significant and largely irreplaceable, and having retained, through some alchemy of celebrity and shamelessness, a public reputation that the documented facts could not seem to touch. He had borrowed nearly $500 million to acquire a national landmark, extracted what capital he could, loaded the remainder with debt it could not service, and walked away holding a minority stake in the wreckage, while his creditors absorbed the losses. This was not a business reversal, it was a template. The Plaza entered 1993 with its debt restructured and its problems otherwise intact. The building required investment that the new ownership structure was poorly positioned to provide. The staff was depleted and by most accounts demoralized in the specific way of people who have watched their workplace be destroyed by someone who professed to love it. The permanent residents who remained were not restored to their former community. They were simply the ones who had not yet left. The hotel's competitive position had declined relative to newer luxury properties that offered amenities the Plaza could not match without capital no one was yet prepared to commit. The question that hung over the building was whether recovery of any meaningful kind was possible. Not physical recovery. The limestone would stand indefinitely, the chandeliers could be cleaned, the protected spaces could be maintained within the constraints of landmark law. The deeper question was whether what had been lost could be rebuilt, whether institutional culture, once systematically destroyed, could be reconstructed in the same place by different people under different management, whether the Plaza could become again what it had been, or whether 1988 represented a permanent before and after, a line in the building's history on one side of which it was a living institution, and on the other side of which it was a very beautiful, very famous hotel. The ownership carousel would keep turning. New buyers would arrive with new capital and new promises and new theories about what the Plaza needed. Some would invest seriously, some would extract efficiently. Each transfer of the deed would bring fresh declarations of restoration and preservation, and each would eventually give way to the next transaction. The building would survive all of them. Whether that constituted a legacy or merely a monument was a question the building itself could not answer. It just kept standing, more durable than the fortunes made within it, more permanent than the men who had fought over it, more patient than any of them had deserved. After Trump, the Plaza did not recover. It transferred. This is an important distinction. Recovery implies returning to something. What followed 1992 was a different process entirely. A succession of owners who arrived with capital and intentions and departed with profits and excuses, each one leaving the building slightly more commodified than they found it. The carousel did not slow down. It accelerated. And with each rotation, the gap between what the Plaza had been and what it was becoming grew wider and more permanent. CDL Hotels of Singapore acquired controlling interest in 1995 for approximately $325 million. The purchase announced, with quiet clarity, that the Plaza had crossed a threshold. It was no longer simply a New York institution. It was a global trophy, available to international capital the way blue-chip art is available, prestigious to own, profitable to hold, transferable to whoever arrives next with a larger check. CDL was professional in the ways Trump had not been. They addressed deferred maintenance. They upgraded neglected systems. They brought competent hotel management to a building that had been run for 4 years as a vehicle for debt service. Staff morale improved in the tentative way it improves when people who have survived something terrible discover that the immediate danger has passed. The hotel began functioning again with something approaching coherence. But the structural damage from the condominium conversions was permanent, and CDL could not undo it. Nor, it became clear, did they intend to. Trump still held his minority stake. a residual presence in the ownership structure that complicated every significant decision. CDL controlled operations but required consensus from other stakeholders for major investments. The fragmentation produced exactly what fragmentation always produces in institutions that require unified vision: paralysis dressed as deliberation. Fairmont Hotels assumed management in 1999, bringing the operational expertise of a company that understood historic luxury properties. The Savoy in London, the Waldorf Astoria, hotels that had survived their own complicated histories by finding owners willing to treat stewardship as the job rather than a constraint on the job. Fairmont understood the assignment. The ownership structure did not give them the tools to execute it. In 2004, Elad Properties, an Israeli development company, acquired the Plaza for $675 million, and the building's transformation from hotel to residential address accelerated into something close to completion. Elad announced additional condominium conversions. The hotel component would contract further. The floors that had housed travelers since 1907 would be reconfigured into private apartments, selling for prices that made Trump's original conversions look modest. Individual units moved for $30 million. A penthouse triplex sold for over $50. The Plaza's name, stripped of almost everything that had originally justified it, retained its market power in the one place such power always survives longest: in the branding of luxury real estate. Preservationists fought the conversions with the tools available to them, which is to say, with arguments and petitions and legal challenges, and the slowly dawning recognition that landmark law, however well-intentioned, had not been designed for this. The designation protected the Palm Court ceiling. It did not protect the hotel rooms above it from becoming someone's pied-à-terre. The grand ballroom was landmarked. The floors of guest rooms surrounding it were not. The law drew its lines around architecture. The architecture was not what was being destroyed. 800 rooms became fewer than 300. The Plaza was now, by any honest measure, a condominium development with a hotel attached, a building that bore the name and the limestone facade of what Harry Black had built while serving an entirely different purpose. The guests who remained paid rates that had climbed to match the building's repositioning as ultra-luxury. The rooms were larger now, more elaborately appointed. The price per night had increased to a level that narrowed the clientele to the point of abstraction. The permanent residents, those final survivors of the Plaza's residential history, protected by rent stabilization laws that no ownership transition had managed to extinguish, continued their long, diminishing struggle. The contrast their presence created was, by this point, genuinely surreal. Working-class families paying controlled rents occupied apartments directly adjacent to units worth tens of millions of dollars. The same elevator served people whose relationship to the building could not have been more different: those for whom it was home, in the oldest and most irreducible sense of the word, and those for whom it was inventory. Legal battles over tenant rights continued for years. Some residents reached settlements and accepted buyouts that ended the fight on terms they could live with. Others held. Each departure shrank the community further, and the community, by now, had been reduced to something that could no longer be called a community in any meaningful sense: a handful of individuals maintaining legal rights in a building that had been structurally redesigned around their absence. The workforce underwent its own quiet erasure. Union representation survived, but the conditions it was negotiating over had transformed beyond what collective bargaining was built to address. The multi-generational employment patterns, sons following fathers, daughters following mothers, families whose identity was bound up in the institution they served, had disappeared entirely, replaced by professional hospitality workers who were competent and transient in equal measure. Staff turnover increased. The institutional knowledge that had once passed between generations through informal apprenticeship simply stopped being transmitted because there was no longer anyone positioned to receive it. Training programs taught procedure. Nobody was teaching what the Plaza had once known about itself. Labor disputes marked the years that followed with a regularity that suggested structural rather than incidental conflict. Union workers struck over wages and conditions. The strikes were real grievances, legitimately held, but they were also symptoms of something that no contract negotiation could resolve, because what had been lost between management and staff was not a disagreement about compensation. It was the shared understanding of what they were all together supposed to be doing. In 2012, the ownership transferred again, this time to Sahara India Pariwar, an Indian conglomerate whose chairman, Subrata Roy, was simultaneously navigating serious legal difficulties with Indian securities regulators. The acquisition drew scrutiny for exactly this reason. The questions about Sahara's financing were not peripheral. They were, as subsequent events made clear, central. Roy was jailed in India in 2014 over securities violations. The company struggled to meet its financial obligations across its global holdings. The Plaza, an American landmark built in 1907 by a Canadian-born New York financier, now found its operational fate entangled with court proceedings in Mumbai. Its future depended on legal outcomes being determined on another continent by a judicial system with no particular investment in what the building meant to the city outside its windows. This was not an accident or an anomaly. It was the logical conclusion of a process that had been underway since 1988. The Plaza had been converted, transaction by transaction, from an institution with roots in a specific place and a specific community into a financial instrument that happened to be located in New York. Financial instruments do not have communities. They do not have cultures. They do not accumulate the kind of meaning that makes a building matter to the people who never set foot inside it. They have balance sheets and ownership structures, and when those structures become distressed, they have creditors. Katara Hospitality, the hotel investment arm of Qatar's sovereign wealth fund, acquired the Plaza in 2018 for a reported $600 million. A government-owned investment vehicle, capitalized by oil revenues, now held the deed to the building Harry Black had imagined into existence on a corner of Fifth Avenue in 1905. The acquisition was professionally managed and financially secure in ways that Sahara had not been. Qatar brought resources. Qatar's sovereign wealth fund administered hundreds of billions of dollars. The Plaza's maintenance requirements presented no meaningful challenge to an entity of that scale. What it could not provide was the thing the building had been losing since Conrad Hilton first standardized it in 1943. An owner whose identity was bound up in the institution itself. Sovereign wealth funds are not irrational actors. They are not careless. They are, by design and necessity, indifferent to the intangible qualities that make a particular building matter in ways that exceed its market value. They manage assets. The Plaza, by 2018, was an asset. The preservation victories were real and should be acknowledged honestly. The palm court ceiling survived. The Oak Room's paneling endured through a dozen management changes and several restaurant operators who had no particular feeling about it. The Grand Ballroom hosted events as it had for a century, its architectural features intact within the protections that decades of advocacy had secured. The bones of the building Harry Black commissioned remained recognizable, but the room count had fallen from 800 to approximately 280. The residential community was gone. The service culture developed across generations had been dissipated through repeated management transitions until there was nothing left to dissipate. The staff knowledge accumulated since 1907, that specific, irreplaceable, entirely human form of institutional memory, had been lost not in a single catastrophe, but in the ordinary arithmetic of turnover and neglect, compounding quietly across decades until the sum became permanent. The landmark law had protected the architecture. Nobody had found a way to landmark the soul. What remained was a luxury hotel in a historic building, which is a fine thing to be and a diminished thing to have become. The famous spaces were still beautiful. The service met contemporary expectations. First-time guests were satisfied, and why wouldn't they be? They had no previous version to compare it against. Those who remembered the Plaza before 1988 moved through the same marble lobby and saw, beneath the familiar chandeliers, the precise outline of everything that was no longer there. Walk into the Plaza today, and the first impression still lands. The lobby delivers what it has always delivered: scale, marble, light fractured through crystal into something that feels less like illumination than like atmosphere. The columns rise, the floors gleam, the chandeliers perform their century-old function of making everyone beneath them feel that they have arrived somewhere worth arriving. First-time visitors receive the full effect. The building does not withhold it. Harry Black commissioned a lobby designed to announce importance, and the announcement still works, which is a testament to the durability of good architecture and the reliability of human vanity in roughly equal measure. The Palm Court still serves afternoon tea. The stained glass ceiling still filters the available light into something warmer and more specific than what falls on the sidewalk outside. The menu has evolved. The prices have climbed to a level that would have seemed satirical in any previous decade. But the ritual persists. The dressed guests, the silver service, the deliberate slowness of an afternoon organized around nothing more urgent than the next pot of tea. People still photograph themselves beneath that ceiling with the particular satisfaction of people documenting their own presence somewhere they consider significant. The room functions as it was designed to function. That this is the most that can be said for it represents both a preservation victory and a quiet diminishment, depending on where you stand. The Oak Room has cycled through restaurant operators with the regularity of a property that has never quite solved the problem of what the space is actually for anymore. The paneling remains. The architectural presence survives: dark wood, heavy proportions, the sense of a room that was built to absorb serious conversation and hold it. But the room that functioned for 6 decades as the unself-conscious center of masculine commercial power in New York, where deals were struck and careers were made and the city's financial life conducted itself in leather chairs over long lunches, that room is gone. What occupies the same physical space now is a restaurant with good bones and no memory. The continuity is structural. It is not cultural. These are not the same thing, and the difference is not small. The guest experience, measured against contemporary luxury standards, is adequate. The reduced room count, a consequence of the condominium conversions that began under Trump and continued under Elad, has allowed for larger, more elaborately appointed accommodations. The technology functions. The service is professional in the way that trained hospitality workers are professional: competent, consistent, and entirely without the institutional knowledge that once made service at the Plaza a different category of experience from service anywhere else. Guests who evaluate hotels by current benchmarks find the Plaza satisfactory. Those who arrive carrying memories of what it was find something more complicated: a beautiful building performing a diminished version of itself, like hearing a great piece of music played correctly but without feeling. The permanent residential community, which had been the Plaza's deepest and most defining secret for most of its history, has effectively ceased to exist. A handful of rent-stabilized tenants remain. They occupy apartments that the building's ownership structure has spent decades trying to reclaim, surrounded now by condominium units worth $8, $12, $20 million. The neighbors they shared decades of daily life with have died or been bought out or simply exhausted by the sustained institutional pressure to leave. The staff members who knew their names and their preferences and their histories have been replaced, once, twice, several times over. They live in a building that still contains their apartments and no longer contains their world. They are the last residents of a community that was dismantled around them while they were still inside it. The condominiums that replace the hotel rooms house a population that exists in a different relationship to the building entirely. Billionaires from multiple continents own units as investments, as tax vehicles, as occasional addresses for the days each year they spend in New York. Some apartments remain empty for months at a stretch. The owners arrive with luggage and depart without ceremony, leaving behind no residue of presence. They purchased the Plaza's name and the view from its upper floors. They did not purchase, because it was no longer available for purchase, any sense of belonging to something. The building contains them when they appear. It does not know them. Harry Black would recognize the structure he financed in 1905. The limestone facade is largely intact, preserved by landmark designation against the alterations that successive owners might otherwise have made. The green copper roof still marks the corner of Fifth Avenue and Central Park South with the same confidence it displayed when the building opened in 1907. The grand proportions, the carved details, the French Renaissance silhouette against the Manhattan sky. All of it survives, a monument to Hardenberg's craft and to the preservationists who spent decades ensuring it would. But the building Black would recognize is not the institution he created, and he would know the difference immediately. He did not build a facade. He built a destination, a place where American wealth and power gathered to perform for itself and the world, where guests and residents and staff formed a living community within walls designed to deserve it. The Plaza he envisioned was a society in miniature, dense with human connection, shaped by accumulated ritual, sustained by people who understood their roles within something larger than any individual transaction. What stands today in that same location is a luxury hotel in a historic building. The distinction sounds modest. It represents the loss of everything that actually mattered. Black's own life describes one of the patterns this story keeps returning to. He built monuments, not just the Plaza, but skyscrapers across the American skyline, through the Fuller Company and U.S. Realty's vast holdings. He accumulated influence and real estate and the particular authority of a man who has made himself indispensable to the physical construction of a city. He achieved, by any external measure, extraordinary success. Then October 1929 arrived, and the market that had made his empire possible collapsed without consulting his plans for it. Properties that had seemed permanent became unsaleable. Debts that had seemed manageable became unsurvivable. The fortune that had taken 30 years to build was gone in months. On July 19, 1930, Harry Black died by suicide at his home on Long Island. He was 67 years old. The building he had brought into existence was 23 years old and operating without him, indifferent to his absence, its chandeliers burning on schedule, its doormen at their posts, its palm court filling with guests who had no particular reason to know or consider the name of the man who had made it possible. This is the specific cruelty that great builders seem disproportionately vulnerable to. The thing they create outlasts them, often by centuries, but provides no protection against the forces that destroy the creator. The Plaza did not save Harry Black. It did not even pause for him. The pattern is not unique to Black, and it is not accidental. It recurs throughout the history of great houses, grand hotels, dynastic estates, and the institutions that wealthy families build to announce their permanence and ensure their legacy. The founder pours vision and capital, and frequently his health, into the creation of something he intends to outlast him. It does outlast him. And then the inheritors and successors arrive, not always malicious, not always incompetent, but almost always more interested in what the thing is worth than in what it means. They extract, they convert, they leverage, they sell. And the building keeps standing through all of it, patient and indifferent, accumulating the marks of every hand that has touched it. Builders create, successors consume. The buildings outlast everyone. This is not a tragedy in the operatic sense, not a story of villains and victims arranged for maximum emotional effect. It is something quieter and more universal. the straightforward observation that institutions require more than a founding vision to survive intact. They require a continuous chain of people willing to accept the responsibility of stewardship over the temptation of extraction. That chain, at the Plaza, was broken in 1988 and never fully repaired. The building at the corner of Fifth Avenue and Central Park South will stand for another century at minimum. The landmark protections will hold, the chandeliers will keep burning, tourists will keep arriving to photograph themselves in the lobby, and the lobby will keep delivering its reliable announcement of importance, and the building will keep absorbing all of it. The visitors, the transactions, the management changes, the ownership transfers, with the same architectural patience it has displayed since October 1907. What it will not do is return to what it was. That is not a failure of preservation. It is not a failure of management or law or good intention. It is the inevitable consequence of decisions made across decades by people who understood the Plaza's value and chose, repeatedly, to spend it. The Plaza endures. The institution it once was does not. And the distance between those two facts is the actual measure of everything that was lost. Not in a single afternoon, not by any single owner, but slowly, transaction by transaction, across the long process of turning something alive into something merely magnificent. The Plaza's story is not really about a hotel. It is about the question that every great landmark eventually forces into the open. Who owns a place that belongs, in some genuine and unlegislated sense, to everyone? The law offers partial answers. Designation protects surfaces. Zoning constrains certain uses. Tenant protections defend whoever remains. But the law cannot require an owner to understand what they have acquired. It cannot mandate care. It cannot compel the particular quality of attention that distinguishes stewardship from possession. That has always been a matter of character, and character cannot be designated. The preservation victories are real and should not be minimized. The Palm Court ceiling survived decades of indifferent ownership. The Oak Room's paneling outlasted every management philosophy applied to the building since 1943. These are genuine achievements, won through sustained advocacy by people who understood that once irreplaceable things are destroyed, the destruction is permanent. They were right, and their victories matter. But physical preservation without the culture that gave the physical spaces their meaning produces something closer to a monument than a living place. Tourists photograph the Palm Court today without any necessary understanding of what afternoon tea once meant in that room, what was exchanged there, what was decided, what kind of community gathered beneath that ceiling every day for decades and called it ordinary. The room is beautiful. The social world it was built to hold is gone. What remains is the container, separated from its contents, admired for its appearance by people who never knew what it once contained. This tension between the building that survives and the institution that doesn't is not unique to the Plaza. It runs through every great house, every dynastic estate, every landmark that has passed through enough hands to have its living culture slowly replaced by its architectural reputation. The building becomes the brand. The brand outlasts everything else. The image grows more durable than the reality it was originally drawn from. The Plaza will change hands again. The carousel has not stopped. New owners will arrive with new capital and the familiar promises, and the building will absorb them, as it has absorbed everyone, patiently, without judgment, without memory. The chandeliers will keep burning. The marble will keep its shine. The corner of Fifth Avenue and Central Park South will keep announcing, to anyone who looks up, that something significant stands here. What that something is, and what it costs to become only what it is, that is the part the building cannot tell you. That requires knowing what came before. It requires understanding that the most expensive thing the Plaza ever lost was never on any balance sheet, never protected by any landmark law, and never recovered by any subsequent owner, regardless of how much they paid or what they promised. The building endures. The institution it once was does not. The architecture outlived the dream, it always does.